hayo walihi, 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 hikiyawe, hayo walihi, kaha asataha, hayo walihi, niwaha winito, hayo walihi, hotaha winiki, hayo walihi, 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 hikiyawe, hayo walihi, kaha asataha, hayo
most of you have been here, some of you haven't been, but we have a paradigm that we work under, an Indigenous paradigm.
In progress.
An Indigenous paradigm that centers Indigenous voices and concerns, and so our scholarship is really directed at community-driven research that actually benefits communities, and we work in close collaboration with communities. Just to give you an example of one of the projects that we're working on before we get to know Andrea better, is we have a rematriation project of a number of digital objects. These are recordings of Indigenous language speakers from the Arikara, Saanish, Dakota, Lakota, the Pawnee and the Nakota or Assiniboine nations, and so there are some 300,000 digital objects in this collection that we're working with these tribal nations to return and hand over stewardship of these collections to the tribal nations, and so this is a partnership that's involving some funding for adding metadata to the collection and actually having some access protocols that the tribal nations want in place so that they can determine who has access and for what purposes, rather than it being a kind of open collection or even a private collection within the Institute as it has been up to this point. So that just gives you an idea what that paradigm that we operate under through that project. So tell us a little bit about, return to Andrea and tell us a little bit about your background and what brings you here, and then also say something more about what you're going to talk about today.
Okay, so I grew up in Oklahoma, but not on the reservation lands of my people. My grandfather was a farmer, and the river washed away the topsoil of a farm that he was renting, so we ended up in Oklahoma City. So we were a little bit distant, so I'm working my way back to my culture, learning my language, things like that. How did I become a philosopher? Oh my gosh, I wanted to be an eye doctor. And I took a logic course, and that was it, I was hooked. So completely switched what I wanted to do. And yeah, and then the rest of it, why a philosopher of science? Why interested in social epistemology? I love the human side of knowledge creation. So we give science sort of this cognitive authority, right? It has a special status. And so for me, I wanted to see what the dynamics were amongst groups that are coming up with knowledge claims. And so that's also gone into looking at Indigenous communities and their knowledge generation and seeing how different they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Tell us a little bit about what you're going to present today and how that fits within your broader research trajectory.
Right, so I'm working on something, so I'm introducing something new, cosmological epistemic injustice. Oh my gosh, right, mouthful. But philosophers just love these big words, right? So I'm going to introduce that because there's a body of literature of when things go wrong in those groups that are generating knowledge, sometimes certain groups or members of groups get oppressed. And so I'm very interested in preventing that from happening. So that's why I'm interested in how they use models or how they communicate with each other. And so that's why I'm sort of interested in that, and that's how it sort of like connects.
Okay, let's, one last question, and it has to do with the focus of the series, the Indigenous Inquiry and Impact, Bridging Knowledge and Community Colloquium Series title. And that is, help us connect your work to how it may benefit your community or Indigenous communities more generally.
Yeah, so what I want to do is I want to bring groups that have been left out or historically marginalized back to the table, back to restoring them as being recognized as knowers, as having knowledge. So a lot of times those groups have been left out, my community as well. So this talk looks at protocols and why protocols or cultural practices are an important part of knowledge generation and how it's a response to what I see as a colonial gatekeeping within Western science.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, so
that's
for
beautiful.
helping my community, it may not just be specific to mine, but I think of it as anyone who shares that same worldview with relation and kinship.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and getting away from a understanding of some kind of objective knowledge that is apolitical and access to it is apolitical and all that. We understand it's interested, it's situated and all of that. So,
Yeah.
great. Well, people are here to listen to you, so I'm going to get out of the way and let you get started. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you. First, I just want to say thank you all for coming, and thanks for all the ones who are online as well. So Buhera was telling me that there's like over 50 people online, right, for this talk. So I am just humbled by it. So let's see. I want to start. Yeah. Getting started. I'm sorry, but I am going to have to stand up. I'm one of those.
Yeah.
Henshe Stonko, Andrea Sullivan-Clarke, Hefketos, Hukupapi, Muscogee Momis. So it's really important for me to say hello. How are you? I'm Andrea Sullivan-Clarke, and I'm from the Muscogee Nation, and I am in the Wind Clan. For me, it's very important to say that because a lot of times Indigenous languages and Indigenous people have been shut out of institutions of higher learning. So for me to be able to say it, and I was even able to say this at the president's house one time when she had some people over for lunch, so I'm like, yeah, right? So before we get started, here's, as I said, I'm from the Muscogee Nation. I have a phrase in the Muscogee Nation, Koka Helidas Helidos, and that means learning is good. And I think once I found that, I latched onto it. So for me, knowledge and knowledge practices are all part of a good thing. Having knowledge is a good thing. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have all the knowledge, but having the ability to know is a good thing. I'm not an elder. I tell my students I'm old. I'm not an elder. I'm not a knowledge keeper. I'm not going to teach you how to be Muscogee or Indigenous in any way. I'm actually coming at this as a philosopher who happens to be Muscogee. So I'll try to not use really big words, but we can't help ourselves. I did take all the Latin out. So I thought that was progress. Great. I'm also going to use the term indigenous, but I'm really going to narrow the scope for that term in the sense that I wanted to apply only to the Native American First Nation communities that share a similar worldview. That means they focus on relationships and kinship. I don't want to, I know that there are other Indigenous communities and I know that there are global Indigenous communities. I don't want to speak for them. I invite them, if they want to contribute to this, right? If they're in this project, I'm there for you, I'm an ally. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you about epistemic injustice, what it is. I'll give you a few examples, hermeneutical injustice, testimonial, quieting, smothering. I'm going to tell you and give you some examples so you'll know what those are. This is the stuff that really, like, when knowledge practices go wrong. And that's not the only way they can, but it's a very, a very narrow sort of scope for that. Then I'm going to tell you about cosmological epistemic injustice, and that's the injustice I think can be levied against Indigenous communities, but also our relatives and relations. So it's going to be a much broader scope. Okay. I'm going to tell you how it got originated, right? Why I think the way I do, and what kind of outcomes come from that, right? So this is my sort of contribution to the area. And then I'm going to talk about protocols, so those cultural practices that we do. They are part of resurgence, so language revitalization, cultural revitalization, all those types of things are an act of resistance to colonialism. So, I mean, they do other things, but I see epistemic injustice as a colonial policy, practice, right? And so I see protocols as a response to it, or a way to resist. And so I'm going to talk about things that come out of colonialism, settler ignorance, we'll have to address that. And then also, I think it can offer some information or flesh out the understanding of the concept sacred. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but it's just something that when you have two worldviews, the Western and the Indigenous, then you have misunderstandings with what it means to be sacred, right? What it means for a place to be sacred or a practice to be sacred. So hopefully it'll clear up or contribute to a little bit more understanding with respect to that. All right, so why social epistemology? Well, like I said, I'm not an eye doctor, right? I wanted to do logic, so I became a philosopher, and philosophers love of wisdom. So you can see I have this trend that I don't know if I was really aware of as I was doing my academic career, but I was very interested in knowledge and how we come up with it, and the seeking out of wisdom and knowledge, right? So that's going to be having me focus on knowledge-generating communities. Doesn't necessarily mean scientists, but scientists do have a cognitive authority that a lot of other knowledge-generating communities don't. We often think that they have special methods, or that they use, that they're more objective. So a statement like, quarks and leptons are the smallest particles in the universe, right, seems to have more authority than I like chocolate ice cream, right? There's something different about those statements, right? And so I'm interested in their practices, and like I said, how people get left out, how groups get left out, because I do believe in like the marketplace of ideas where diversity is a good thing. I know I guess I'm old school on that one now, but it's also diverse opinions and beliefs and statements coming together challenge each other. So I think that it helps, that tension helps, that critical thinking helps get us toward the truth or towards wisdom. I don't know if we can get there fully, but I think that's the best process to have. Now, you're probably familiar with epistemic injustice, even if you weren't familiar with the term. So here's an example that you're probably familiar with. The use of residential schools. Because children were taken from their homes and placed in these schools, they lost their access to language and they lost their access to cultural practice. That prevented them from having knowledge. So this is one obvious way. We haven't even gotten to the testimony stuff. That's the stuff I'm interested in. But this is just one obvious way in which someone can prevent someone else from having knowledge. Right? Another one is putting disinformation out there. Right? And so if you see the marker for Lake Superior, the first sentence, it was discovered in 1629 by the French explorer Brulé. Right? Okay, yet there was a lot of Anishinaabe communities living around Lake Superior, right? So it's a way of erasing. So it's disinformation that's put out there for the public, and a lot of historical markers do this, right? Now, you might push back and say, Andrea, these were created a long time ago, right? But if you look over here, it's 2012. So we have learned something since, right, since these were originally created. We just haven't changed them. And there are groups that are trying to change them. So there are people pushing back on this type of stuff. So these are just a couple of injustices that prevent people from being in the position of being a knower. Yeah. Now I'm interested in what they call injustice in cases of philosophical testimony. Now, what is philosophical testimony? You've heard of testimony, that's the stuff you give in court, right? Philosophical testimony just means, you don't have to be in court. So anytime you make a statement, a true-false statement usually, you're giving testimony. So if I ask you, how do I get to, I don't know, Buffalo Louis, whatever, you give me an answer, you're giving me testimony. Right? Now, as me asking the question, I'm not giving testimony. I'm not stating a fact, right? So whenever you're stating a fact, like it's not raining outside, oh, thank heavens, right? Then you're giving me testimony, and that's where I'm sort of interested in the dynamics of who can give testimony, who can be prevented from giving testimony, when people don't listen, right, and the reasons that they don't. So that's the stuff that I take to be important or interesting. Right? So here's an example, hermeneutical injustice. Man, we do love our big, yeah, can't get away from it. So all it has to do is with translation. So someone in a society cannot provide testimony because they don't have the vocabulary to articulate it. And so an example would be in the 1970s, there was workplace harassment, sexual harassment, but the women couldn't articulate that issue because the society was set up in a way they didn't have the vocabulary then. Now they have the vocabulary. So Dr. Jean Lee Thomas and I are working on a paper in this area about NAGPRA. And does the imposition of the new rules for NAGPRA prevent communities from articulating their needs? Okay. So for me, yes, it's definitely, I'll let you know if it gets published. So societal structures lead to a lack of vocabulary that causes the injustice. Here's a second example. And it's normally, these are all by Miranda Fricker, these two. Testimonial injustice is when you're giving testimony, but the listener or your audience discounts what you're saying. You don't get credibility from them because they might have implicit biases or beliefs about your social identity, or they might not think you're trustworthy or credible. So in that case, your testimony is weighted less heavily than others. So you can have testimonial injustice actually working the opposite way, where someone has biases toward others, like white male professors, right, would have more credibility than if I were to tell you about testimonial injustice, right? So there are these sides. So you could give too much credibility, or you could give too little credibility, and that prevents them from providing testimony. Okay, now Christy Dodson introduces a couple of new ones. So Miranda Fricker went for a while, but she was like, wait a minute, there's something about groups that prevent members of groups from participating. So she mentions one called testimonial smothering. And testimonial smothering is when you actually don't provide testimony because the atmosphere might be violent or dangerous. Okay? So if you can imagine yourself being like the single member in a group, right, where majority of the members are dominant society, you might not be willing to provide testimony. You just keep quiet because it's too dangerous for you to do that. So people from marginalized communities have often not provided testimony in these things. An example might be black women who don't provide testimony because they don't want to be seen as the angry black woman, right? So that's something that would prevent them from speaking out. And then testimonial quieting is very similar to testimonial injustice in the sense that it is discounting the hearer, but it discounts them so much they don't even get credibility. So they're a member of a particular group, and I think of this one as Native Americans or First Nations whose testimony with respect to residential schools was not listened to for a long time. Those members of those groups, they received no uptake. They weren't seen as credible testifiers. And so that's another way in which someone could not provide testimony. So difference between the Fricker is you're just getting a less degree of credibility, and for the Dodson, you're a member of a group that prevents you from actually being able to get uptake from anyone in the dominant society or the dominant group. All right. So this is just kind of breaking them down. Lacks resources for hermeneutical, the speaker's disbelieved for testimonial, chooses not to speak because they won't be heard safely, and then the other one is the speaker is unheard completely. Okay. So, a lot of interesting things to think about, right? But when I was thinking about this, I was like, it's all coming from Western epistemology, all right? And what's under, what's grounding that? Well, it's a Western worldview that is largely anthropocentric and individualistic too, right? It's not super community. I mean, it's telling that Christy Dawson, as a non-white philosopher, is mentioning groups being left out of the conversation, where Fricker was more interested in individuals than she is a non-Indigenous white philosopher, right? It's also a cultural imperialism, the knowing better. Our practices and things are much better than your practices. I've had lots of people tell me about how Indigenous science doesn't meet Western science, but they're usually coming from a largely uninformed view. Right? There's a little bit of ignorance going on in the background. It's gendered. It's also capitalist. More is better. Knowledge is power, right? So that's why we can change the story with those historical markers and preserve power or preserve the status quo for dominant groups, right? We just had Thanksgiving, and you all know the old-fashioned, right, the old traditional story of Thanksgiving. Right? Those are things that are put out there that are kind of like our myths, our national myths, right? So simply put, it's colonial, right? Epistemic injustice is colonial, but epistemology, just the whole thing about how do we know what we know, is framed by a Western worldview. One of the things I noticed is that it doesn't have any humility. We think we know everything, right? We think that we can introduce species, you know, and then get upset because they become invasive. Or we think that we are the only ones who have the tools to solve climate change. Stuff like that, right? But that view from nowhere is a separation. So to me, it's so obvious. It's so non-Indigenous. It's a separation from the world. It takes us out of it to where we think that we can manage it in some way. That's why I really cringe when I go to environmental papers and I hear stewardship or management, and I'm just like, please don't say stuff like that, right? We don't know everything, right? So compared to the Indigenous worldview, where we have creation stories, humans are latecomers. We learn from the animals. We learn from the plants, right? We take our cues from them. It's reciprocal, right? They are our relations, our relatives, or our kin, right, in different times. So they have our best interest, but it's not like we always have their best interest, in a way, right? Especially under that Western worldview. And it leaves out some of the virtues. So the Anishinaabe share with my people some of these, like humility. You don't have humility, you don't have respect or gratitude. I mean, that was one of, if you think about all the things that they provide for us to be here, it's humbling in a way, right? And so the stories also provide guides for living the right way, and they usually rely upon our interactions with plants, animals, and the landscapes, and seascapes. And so for me, epistemic injustice affects that in the cosmological way. So that's why I want to call it cosmological epistemic injustice, because I want to draw a line between the anthropocentric versions and this version that I think affects plants, animals, and their status as knowers. Fricker wants to say that when you do epistemic injustice to another person, you harm them as a human. I want to say if you do epistemic injustice to the plants, the animals, the landscapes, that type of stuff, you're doing not only harm to the humans, but you're doing it to beyond human. I mean, the scope for me is much broader, much bigger. Yeah. So Kimmer sort of sums it up. She points to when we're talking about animals, how they can't communicate, and the standards are anthropocentric. Right? We do this all the time with, I mean, when I was up in Canada, working in Canada, the monarch butterflies would come through. They go up to Canada and then they go down to Mexico and they don't know what they're doing. I mean, that just seems bizarre, right? And so for me, it's when we say stuff like, oh, it's only instinct. or it's merely biology, or they have no conscience, they have no sentience, or even Descartes, they're automatons? Really? Animals are robots? I just don't buy it. So for me, this is a really, all my philosophy papers are based on some gut reaction that I've had, no, right? And so that's why I think it's important to pay attention to the cosmological, let's see, I want to go back, the cosmological epistemic injustice, because I think it does harm, it breaks relations, and it does damage. So if we have that in our society, right, if you buy what I'm claiming about cosmological epistemic injustice, then I want to say that our protocols and our resurgence of culture and language, my walking back, right, my taking the journey to go back to my culture is an act of refusal. It's an act of resistance, right? We take the relationships, we have all these networks, how it all works together, and it creates indigenous knowledge systems. And that's sort of the mechanics or the nuts and bolts of what's going on. And then I see cosmological epistemic injustice as breaking that. It's destroying knowledge systems. So it demands a response. It demands a resistance. And so thinking of protocols as remembering to remember those original instructions that we were given in our creation stories is so important because it will inform that concept of sacred. So when Nona LaDuke talks about how the court systems can't keep people from building ski slopes in the desert because they don't understand that that land is sacred, or that we put Mount Rushmore on the side of a cliff, or a mountain, because they don't understand what exactly is sacred. They'll ask, how sacred is it? At what times of day is it sacred? Right? It's a very Western understanding. So what we need is to have something decidedly indigenous that provides a response to this, and then also get the other, I'm flipping the script on the other, to understand what it means to be sacred. I think it can also address policies of assimilation, so people that are, like me, coming back, right? Communities can welcome them with open arms. And I've had nothing but good things from my community, wanting us to come back, wanting us to get the language, especially if you've lost it through no fault of your own. Right? And then it answers modernity in a way that people a lot of times think, well, if you're going back to the old ways, I didn't quite say that. I said we were going to learn the language, practice the culture, but all of it is informed by the relationships, and so those relations will actually be needed for dealing with AI, or data centers, or climate change, or any of those types of things. We stand in relation to them. We stand in relation to computers and laptops, right? So we have ways of dealing with this stuff. They don't rice in birch bark canoes sometimes. They use aluminum, right? It's okay to do some of the modern stuff. You don't have to go back in time. It's actually allowing indigenous cultures to be dynamic in a way that people don't usually let you, right? I think sometimes when people meet me and they say, oh, you don't look indigenous, I think what they're expecting is the Hollywood kind of thing. Yeah, no, I'll never be in Hollywood. But it's also a corrective practice ethically. I think of epistemic injustice as an ethical issue that throws the world out of balance and harmony. And so if it does that, then the protocols are going to be putting things back into balance and harmony. It's a good thing to be doing these. And I don't mean that everyone should be doing them. So what about the settler or the colonizer? Do I think that they should start adopting Muscogee practices? No. I want everybody to come to the table. Because remember when I mentioned the tension between two different views? That's where we start getting toward what's real and what's not real, what's truthful and what's not truthful. We need those. So we need those fringe views. I know you think, really? You want to have some of these like really weird views out? Yes, I do. So if we stand in relation to others, we're going to stand in relation to settlers and colonizers. They are in an inverted epistemology. That comes from Charles Mills. They see the world in one way that's not really there. They think brulee right, discovered Lake Superior, right? So they're misinformed, and they need to be re-informed, right? We need to challenge some of their beliefs, unsettle the settler mindset. So there's not only one way to do this. If you look at Indigenous ethics, then we're a cob of corn, like Brian Burkhart says at sometimes, but we're also individual kernels. And our communities allow us, through the stories, to choose the way of right and wrong, to choose the path. I have full autonomy to think about what it is to be a good Muscogee, and then try to think or make my actions fit to that sort of view, right? So there are going to be different ways, not just a set of rules that you follow in order to get balance back. And some of these are going to be protesting and confrontational. Some people are better at it than others, right? Some form Indigenous teach-ins and outreach, and you'll see, because this is an issue of ignorance, I'm going to be focusing on the things that inform. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other responses to colonialism, right? So literature, art, comedy, film, and TV, only some, right? I don't want John Wayne movies to be the thing that people use. I would like the things that are made by Indigenous authors, Indigenous writers, Indigenous actors, and directors. That type of thing can help sneak in and inform in ways that we're not aware of. I think that we need to develop strategies that counter settler moves to innocence. So this is the Tuck and Yang article on decolonization. It's not a metaphor. If you haven't read that, there's just a couple of, or a few things that they say. So people who claim Native heritage but don't do anything about it, right? Maybe saying that you have an ancestor who's royalty, right, in your past. That's sort of questionable, right? So we need something that would address that. Also helping them to realize that being informed does not mean land back. So you can do all the reading and the comedies and be up on everything, but if you're not giving land back, then you're not fully decolonized. And then the other one is, and I put this one kind of from myself, the Indian problem. We see this a lot in science, where sociologists and scientists go to the reservations and they are looking for solutions to the problems that they have on the reserves or the reservations, but they don't look at society and the societal structures. So they're sort of ignorant in that way. We need to address that, right? And some tribes have been doing this. So some tribes have their own internal review boards. Some have, you can't do any research on us and publish it without our permission, right? So they are becoming more autonomous and more active. So for me, I feel hopeful. So we understood that we had the best teachers, right? So we need to be good teachers ourselves, I guess is what I want to say. And in conclusion, how would I sum it up? Cosmological epistemic injustice is something that should be addressed, should be written about, and that the dominant society should be made aware of. And so that's where I'm working. So that gives you a little bit of idea of what I'm doing when I actually close my office doors and you hear me furiously. Right? Thank you so much, Mado.
Thank you so much. So we do have a little time for questions, and if you would, you ask a question, project your voice a bit so the microphone can get it there and the microphone and the camera can get it as well, so we have the question as well as the answer. Yeah, thank you. Or comment. Yeah.
I have a question. Also, first, Andrea, thank you so much for this talk. As someone in rhetoric and this philosophy adjacent, I was eating it up. But you also said my academic trigger word, which is hermeneutics. I like that word. But.
Oh, yes. Yeah. But I'm only pulling it from the literature.
No, I know. It's not your fault. But I did have a question because I really wanted to. I was hoping you could unpack this term epistemic injustice just a little bit more.
Oh, okay.
I thought that you did a really good job of framing it within the literature. Mm-hmm. But are we thinking of epistemic injustice as like the problem, or is it the original theory that then cosmological epistemic injustice is then like revising and extending?
Oh, okay, yeah. So what I'm thinking about is I'm working from like John Stuart Mill's Marketplace of Ideas, where everybody brings their ideas in and they have like battles about, So hopefully we would have these discussions, egalitarian, and we would get somewhere from those, right, towards the truth.
Okay, okay.
Now, I'm a pluralist too, so I would allow that. So epistemic injustice would be the things that are unfairly done to others
Right.
to prevent that from happening.
I think I was completing it in my brain because I was thinking a lot about Walter McNoll's term, epistemic disobedience.
Oh yeah, epistemic refusal is another
Yes.
one, right?
Yeah, and so I think I was
Yeah.
conflating them in my head, which is why I wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, because that's a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
I could come across as we've got to share all our knowledge. Oh heck no, I don't believe that either.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, or it might be a safe space sort of thing, like the gatekeeping, sort of like who's using it and why, sort of stuff. So it is a very fancy dance with this type of stuff. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks for the question. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. It's so cool. I'm in philosophy, and philosophy
Yay.
and HBS are just so siloed from each other here. So it's like, I'm so
Well, we're
excited.
all furiously typing away, right?
I guess so. Yeah, we're gonna touch each other. So I'm so happy to be here. I was thinking throughout this talk about what Emmeline Davis has called identity prejudicial credibility excess.
Oh yeah.
So, and I think of her because she studied philosophy here, actually. She did her doctorate
Oh,
here
awesome.
in the philosophy program. So that's why she was on my mind. But her concept is, okay, there's, credibility deficit, which you talk about, right? And it's like you're not taken seriously as a credible knower.
Yeah.
But then there's this kind of inverse thing where she in this paper argues that happens sometimes when people like draw on stereotype, right? You deploy a stereotype about someone that like prima facie, like on its face, seems to be giving someone a kind of credibility excess, and yet she's arguing this is still a uniquely like epistemic kind of harm. So she gives the example of stereotype about like Asian people, right? A deployment of a stereotype of Asian people like being particularly excellent in particular, areas of academics, right? She has a little toy case about like 2 students at a high school, and one of them is like, I'm always asking this kid who sits next to me to help me, to study for math exams or whatever, and this kid is like, why are you coming to me? I'm not the math guy, right? But it's because he's deploying this stereotype about Asian people. And I also was thinking about, right, like I have a friend who writes a lot about this thing that she encounters over and over again in her organizing work, where her positionality as like a black woman gets her put in this, kind of on a plinth or whatever, what's the word, on a pedestal, right, where it's like she is taken by like non-black people that she organizes with as like the authority on like matters of restorative justice or something, where it's like, in a lot of areas she might have, right, an epistemic advantage over other folks. And yet the way that sort of credibility excess is like deployed for her is like for her something that she experiences as like harm, right? Where it's like, I want to collaborate with you, right? I want to invite you to do this practice with me and not be come to with I think this distinctively kind of Western way of thinking about, right? Like there's some people who are the authorities, and so we're just going to figure out who's the right person that I'm supposed to defer to in this room. And that is how we get knowledge, right? There's someone that has it, and then they just tell you what it is.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was really long-winded. But I'm curious because there is this critique of Emmeline Davis's concept of this epistemic credibility excess that says, well, it's really just stereotypes, right? This isn't like a distinctively epistemic kind of harm, and of the kind that like Fricker or Dawson would describe.
Yeah.
But that it's just like, well, it's the harm of stereotypes, right? It's just like you shouldn't have those stereotypes, and it's nothing to do with like your place in a community of knowers or something. So I'm curious what side you take on that. Do you think that the kind of credibility excess thing might be in this, epistemic cosmological injustice, like a distinctive kind of harm? Because obviously you can think of, right, deployments of like the noble savage kind of stereotype, right? This John Wayne picture where it's like, tell me what's sacred and I'm gonna like uptake it into, my Western worldview, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm it's like, it looks like I'm deferring in this way, but it's actually.
Well, I don't think it relies on stereotypes in a way. So
That's
one
really
of the anti-vax movements, right, was initiated by the medical doctor who published in a journal of medicine, right, the British, I think it was the Lancet, but
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
white
Was it like-
doctor,
sorry.
not, I mean, the stereotype, the bias was in favor of him because he was a physician, so not necessarily, I mean, yeah, I suppose, I don't see that as a stereotype, I see that as some members of our community When we're just deeming expertise, so in medical issues, you'll have someone who's going to be an expert. A doctor would be more of an expert than, say, someone else. So I don't think it has to be a stereotype. It definitely wouldn't be the case with cosmological epistemic injustice. I would say, well, it's not just species, because I think rivers and forests and mountains, I mean, my friend does rocks, right? So even rocks, I think, don't get the cognitive authority stamp. They are not seen in our society as knowledge holders. We think that they can't communicate their knowledge, but, you know, Indigenous people since time immemorial have been learning from them, so there has to be some sort of communication going on there, right? So I don't think it'd be stereotypes. Some of it is stereotypes, and it's very pernicious in the sense that implicit bias, we're not aware of them, and they operate instantly. So within the first couple of seconds of meeting someone, we've already formed some opinions, and we haven't really had a good conversation with them to know who they are. So we do have those sorts of things, and even when people are informed about them, they don't always repair that, right? They don't make the changes necessary. Those things, habits are hard to break.
Yeah.
So I would disagree with the stereotype part. Is it speciesist? Well, no, because we've got the mountains and all that type of stuff. So the beyond human. So if we had a category beyond human, then I would say, yeah, it's anti that, right? If you're not human, you're not going to be a knower, right? And then some humans, for the Western worldview, are going to be better knowers than others, more reliable, have more expertise or something like that.
Right, so there is that like deference, epistemic deference.
I think there is. Yeah. And I think too, by telling someone or giving them the authority when it's beyond their ability, you've done them harm as well. So it's not just the harm to the marginalized people, but it's harm to the person you've over-given the credit to. I do buy that.
That's it, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because I get tapped all the time to review things as an Indigenous scholar, and I have no idea what the paper's saying. And I was like, you really think I'm an expert in this? No, I'm not. You know, and I have to just decline because I was just like, I shouldn't be like, no. Yeah.
So you mentioned in one of your last slides there about Indigenous teaching. And you inspired me, and I'm thinking about my East Gathering that Caitlin organized. And I'm also thinking about First Nations Educational Cultural Center, Shireen, and Michael Ng's Native American Indigenous Studies program, and wondering if, letting people know that I'm interested, if you all are interested in moving that towards some kind of funded event. But then I also wanted to ask you, Andrea, to elaborate a bit on that and what you think that could entail. Or in your experience, what those have entailed?
Well, up in Canada, they had guided walks through the history of the town. Mm-hmm. They had communities like Walpole Nation who worked with the Detroit River, so they had a river science. And so they talked about the indigenous science of the river and not the Western, or you might have some, the thing that I don't like is sometimes when we had Three Sisters for lunch, and I just want to tell you, that was yummy. But sometimes they talk about Three Sisters and then they'll say, oh, and look, it confirms Western. Well, no. Why doesn't Western science confirm what we've known all along? Right? It's the longer period. When you find a dinosaur bones, you know, and it's a new species, you get to name it. Well, we were here first, is kind of what I want to say, right? Yeah, I think those are great opportunities to get people on your side in a way. It's not the be-all, end-all, but I think it's a wonderful way to establish relations that are fractured and they're just not working, and we're talking past each other. And you know, it's so for me, that's a great way of getting together on that type of stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a very straightforward question. First, thank you, this was amazing. And this is something that affects me as a PhD scholar and thinker, and I wanted to know your opinion. How can we break this colonial Western epistemology is inside academic life because I'm wondering when I'm writing my dissertation, is it enough for me to engage and quote all of those indigenous thinkers? Because like even doing a dissertation is is something that is compiled. Like
I know,
really,
right? It's hard.
Yeah, it's very hard. So I wanted to know what your
So for all the
takes
grad
on this.
students who are here, thank you.
Figure it out, let me know.
Yeah, how do we change the institutions? And some thinkers want to say that we actually should just have indigenous institutions. They've given up on the Western institutions. I've been steeped in the Western institutions so long that I want to say, don't forget about us, right? We do have some power and we do things on the side. Yeah, I'm not going to give away our secrets or anything, but I think sometimes just the simple things like flipping your classroom and making a circle or going outside. I actually have a fellow professor, he's retired now, but he would take the students out to some of the places and they would have relations with trees, not bad relations, right? This is not weird stuff, but learning about a tree, going out there and being with a tree and seeing it, right? There's a book in existential philosophy called I Am Now by Martin Buber. The first chapter, just read the first paragraph, right? It's like that connection with the other, the connection with the tree, right? I think there are ways that we can do some of that and bring in things. I would like to have an elder be present as part of the university, right? We had that at Windsor. They were part of the law school, so but us simple people over in the other departments could benefit from them as well. Yeah. Just a lot of different things. I worry that most of my thoughts are going to be DEI, but that doesn't stop me from trying sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like we are relying more on individual initiatives rather than structural. Because sometimes we don't have power enough to change structures, and we just have to play the game in order to inform more people.
Yeah, you play the game and then you take an inch.
Yeah.
Play the game, take an inch, right? That's why it's nice to have this place on campus, because now we can have these talks. I can meet with the people who I never see because I'm working. I can see their talks and attend their talks, and we have working groups and things like that so that we can go together. I'm going to be having in the fall, I believe it's September 18th and 19th, but it could be wrong, a conference, so panels and things that people will be invited to come. And have Indigenous people talking on wellness, because I wanted something positive for a change. That's the one thing, practice self-care, because it is draining, right? And so take care of yourself, take care of others, kind of thing. Yeah, you're welcome.
Last questions?
Hey, how's it going?
So it's nice to finally be able to see you present your work in person.
And not sit on the other side of the desk and chat about stuff? Yeah.
But I was just, so on one of the slides you mentioned how you didn't advocate for everyone to adopt Muscogee culture,
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering what your thoughts were on kind of cultural reestablishment, and what I mean by that is giving my background on thinking of that. I'm learning the lingua franca of the Americas, but I'm also learning the indigenous languages of where I go in the Americas. And so for me, that's a way that I can help kind of move back into the reestablishment of using place names, of indigenous place names, and keeping the language alive, and maybe interacting with the indigenous peoples and nations of where I'm at. And so I was wondering if you see anything, or you've seen anything in how that can be used in a way to kind of move away from English as a national language in all of the lands we're here in the U.S., and kind of integrate more and more the traditional culture of where we're at.
Yeah, especially when some of those names do harm, right? So some of the mountains in Arizona, right, were harmful names, and they recently changed those. I think it's a wonderful thing to learn languages, to be able to communicate, because you don't directly translate word for word languages. They have special meanings. So to be able to communicate and then start bringing in those meanings and things, I think is a wonderful way. I mean, I'm all about relationship, and I don't see that as harming the relationship. I don't see it as being appropriative or exploitive or anything like that. It's really more of a reaching out to say, hey, I want to communicate. You're valuable. I see you. I want to be able to communicate with you. So for me, that's a good thing. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, the language of colonialism has spread to where even France is worried about losing its language as we have more inventions. So this is a really dated story, but when computers first came out, France wanted to insist upon having a French word, I don't know what it is, for mouse, because they did not want to use mouse or computer, right? They wanted to preserve some of their language because that's very important to their identity and how they see themselves. Yeah, so being able to do that in a way that's not, what do they call it, like cosmopolitanism, right? I'm sampling a little bit of this, and and I understand you by eating at the restaurant that serves the food of your people. That's that's very superficial. It's very offensive in a way. I think learning the language takes time and dedication. I think that shows that you're sincere. Yeah. A good point to end, right?
Yeah,
Sincerity.
I think so.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank
you so much. I also want to thank Native American Indigenous Studies Program as well as First Nations Educational Cultural Center for providing me lunch and making this much more comfortable
While the
space for
boys are doing
community.
this, girls will sing the melody up higher and above this ostinato.